Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you happen to be dialing into this from wherever in the world. So I'm Andy Hindle. I'm the conference chair at the Identiverse conference. Delighted to be hosting today's second Identiverse webinar. Those of you with particularly keen eyesight will have noticed that the little splash screen we had is actually for the previous one. So we're still kind of, smoothing out a couple of rough edges here. But if you're interested in the authorization conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago, that one is actually still hosted up on the Identiverse website under webinars, and you're welcome to go and have a look at that. We today are going to be talking a little bit about some of the future trends that our guests are seeing in the industry, in the identity industry as a whole. For some context around that, for those of you that aren't familiar with the Identiverse conference, we've been running for about 15 years, broadly focused today on the identity industry as a whole. So that includes all of the traditional IAM kind of architectural standards-based stuff. It includes all of the newer digital identity things around things like verification and proofing and wallets and all of that stuff. We're increasingly getting into some of the adjacent areas like privacy and ethics and some of the cybersecurity aspects of all of that too. And some of the business areas that all of that kind of impacts. So I've got with me today a number of members of the content committee. Most of our agenda at Identiverse comes through an open and public call for presentations, but 80% of the agenda comes that way. And that gives us an interesting and fairly unique insight into things that practitioners, things that the industry think are important. And then, of course, everyone on the committee, including our wonderful guests today, have their own highly informed and very valuable perspectives on that. So we'll talk about some of that today as well. We may have an opportunity for some questions. I'd suggest holding those to the end if you wouldn't mind, and then put them in the Q&A, and I'll do my best to run through at least a couple of those if we've got some time at the end. If we don't, we'll pick up any of those and any commentary that might come up in the chat as well. That will get through to everyone that's speaking today for us to review afterwards. So with that, what I would like to do is to just allow everyone that's joining us today from a panelist perspective to just do a quick round of introductions. And I don't know what order we're going to go in, so we'll find out as we go along. Let's see who speaks first to introduce themselves today.
Well, I'll go. Hello, everyone. My name is Greg Smith. I'm a principal solution consultant with Radiant Logic, where I've been working for the past 2 years. Prior to that, I was a customer and an identity practitioner where I ran identity and access management engineering for a large global pharmaceutical. So I've got a lot of business background in getting my IAM projects through approvals and buying software and getting it implemented. But now I'm on the sales side and having a lot of fun doing it. And also, as Andy says, I'm part of the content committee. I work on the deployments and leading practices track. And I have 2 co-leads who work with me. So there are 3 of us working together this year. In the past few years, it's only been 2. So it's good to have some extra help because this year we had a lot of content to review and down select to the finalists for our track. And we have some really good stuff coming for you at Identiverse. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of that later today. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks, Greg. Who's next?
I'll jump in. Hi, everybody. Eve Mailer. I'm the founder of Venn Factory, which is a consultancy helping you develop irresistible identity strategies. I'm the former CTO of ForgeRock, so I was recently sell side for technology. I'm kind of a standards wonk, had a lot to do with things like SAML and going back before that, XML, showing my age. I have the privilege of working with 2 of the topics of Identiverse this year, architecture, standards and engineering. I'm thinking ASE in my head, and also strategy and vision. And I partnered with a number of the great content committee folks on both of those topics. And so I'm really looking forward to today.
Wonderful. Thanks, Eve. And yeah, Eve and I share a little bit of background in the XML space. I won't bore everyone with it today, but yeah, we've had a number of conversations about things like SGML. Let's move on to Lance. I've decided I'm going to name people now. So let's move on to Lance.
We got selected now. Cool. Hi, my name is Lance Peterman. I have spent most of my career on the practitioner side of identity, currently working as the program lead for identity at Dick's Sporting Goods. Before that, I worked in the financial services and the pharmaceutical side, so I've kind of seen a lot of different industries in this space and where some of the pain points are. This year, I'm pleased to be part of what we're calling the C3 committee, which is the customer, consumer, and citizen identity track. I'm working with two other amazing people on that track. Like Greg said, it's great to have a number of different hands working through this content, because the number of submissions, both in terms of quality and number, have been just simply amazing. And really looking forward to sharing what's going to be coming up in June, late May, with y'all.
Tell us about your side hustle. Lance, tell us about your side hustle. Yeah, that's really important in the industry.
Oh, thank you. So my side hustle is, in addition to trying to do identity, I'm trying to create future identity practitioners at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. I am an adjunct professor there, and I teach on average about 2 courses a semester. And we'll once again be taking up that mantle in the fall to teach another identity class and hopefully create another slate of identity folks.
Fantastic. One of the best things about moderating this panel is I don't have to do any work, because you guys are just going to talk and it'll be fine. But the one job I can do at this point is ask Arynn to introduce herself, please.
Hi, I'm Arynn Crow. I'm the Senior Manager of User Authentication at AWS, and I also serve on the Board of Directors for the FIDO Alliance and for the newly created Digital Identity Advancement Foundation. I've led previously the professional development or pro dev track in prior years, and this year I'm moving over to the security track. Having worked across 2 different tracks now, I can say all across the board, Identiverse content is always great no matter which track you're looking at, but I'm especially excited this year to get to share some of the cool stuff that we have coming up in the security world.
Fantastic. Thank you. So, yeah, it's funny. I think pretty much everyone said, wow, we had a lot of submissions this year. And it's absolutely true. It's actually the bit that I find the hardest when I do this. And I've been doing this. This is my 10th year actually this year. Is we get a lot of proposals and they're all really good. And unfortunately, we kind of have to pick and choose and say no to some of them. But it does give us the opportunity to look at that sort of breadth of material and try and kind of draw out a few, sort of notable things that spike in a given year, right? And so in prior years, we've gone, hey, there's an awful lot of blockchain related identity stuff. We should probably talk about that a bit. And often we predict those things in advance. Sometimes we're a little bit surprised. So I'd love to just get a sense from folks of what things do you think came out of the CFP? And I guess within that, what things were you expecting? What were you not expecting? Is there anything that you thought we would see that we ended up not really seeing very much of? Be good to kind of get a sense of that from folks. And again, I'm not going to nominate people. I'm definitely not doing that. It's much better if you guys just decide as we go along. So.
I'll take a first crack at it. Kind of going into it, I was looking for a couple of things. Number one, being part of this track, I was looking forward to the submissions on the consumer side in particular, partly as a bias because I'm now working on the retail side. So, seeing those customer journeys is an important part of my life now. And I think the 2 areas that I was expecting to see a lot of, one which was validated, was I knew passkeys were going to be a very popular topic, and the submissions definitely proved that out. And then also, I was kind of curious in the AI space where we were going to see some of the content come in, and it has been interesting to see that manifest itself. But I didn't see nearly as many submissions as I thought we might. And I think part of that's a reflection of I don't think we really know how a lot of this is going to manifest itself just yet. We have some ideas, like, some obvious ones are in the attack space, leveraging AI to impersonate identities. But how AI becomes an asset for an organization from an identity perspective, I think, is going to be an interesting area for us to look at, both at the conference and I think going forward.
I think if you didn't see as many of them in your track, it's because they were in the security track. We definitely had a lot of related content, even more than I expected, although that was one of the things that I thought this year we would see a lot. Both in the side of people who are excited about the opportunities that AI brings as we can scale some of our security technologies, I think, but also a lot of content around concerns that people have. Not that AI necessarily brings new attack vectors, but makes the ones that we have easier to scale. Which has historically been one of the things that we kind of rely on to mitigate attacks, is, right, how can we make it more difficult and more expensive for someone that's trying to access our services. Another thing that I saw a lot of that was more than I expected was explorations about federation across multiple different cloud services. I saw a lot of emphasis, and I'm sure maybe Eve, you could speak to what you guys saw in the architecture and standards world as well, but a lot of different explorations about what are the threat models looking like and how are they changing. And people needed to, or felt like they needed to get a lot more familiar with the details of OAuth, of OIDC, to make sure that we understand the nuances of these connections.
Yeah, in fact, great observations. Andy used the word breadth, and all the submissions certainly had breadth. What came to mind for me looking at architecture, standards, engineering was depth, maturity, seasoning, just from experience. So 3 examples that I noticed readily were things like Pam Dingle is going to be treating a discussion of ACR, the missing security control. We have David Broussard, who's going to be looking at IAM and how it sort of compares with OWASP. And then in the passkey world, in the FIDO world, a Microsoft practitioner is going to be sharing learnings from deployment. And I just think all those 3 are really exciting examples of this kind of subtlety. And I did notice that kind of multi-federation angle as well, which is obviously a deepening of what we've been doing for a long time. And frankly, what higher education institutions have been facing and doing for a long time. I think it's starting to come to B2B trust a little bit.
Yeah,
right.
That's a really. Go ahead, Greg.
No, go ahead, Andy. Then I'll weigh in.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a really interesting observation, that the multilateral federation thing. So, Eve, you're absolutely right. We've seen that for years in higher ed, and I know some of us, including me, have worked on some large scale kind of commercial multilateral federation deployments, but there aren't many of them. And so I think it's fair to say that the standards and frankly the products haven't necessarily evolved in that particular direction, but it's starting to change. I do wonder whether we're going to run into a slightly challenging moment where some of the decentralized approaches kind of run into the adoption of multilateral federation and what implications that might have. That's probably a lengthy, heavily technical topic that we may not want to get into today, but I suspect there might be something there. And the other thing, which we'll come back to in a minute, but I want to pick Greg up first, is as part of that cross-organizational federation effort, the notion of truly external kind of delegated authorization is, I think, one that is highly relevant to the industry, but which we also saw a number of proposals around. And that's at an earlier stage, right? It's a little bit more nascent, a little bit more like how do we build the standards and the architecture to support that. We'll come back to that in a little bit, I suspect. But Greg, you had an observation?
Yeah, I had a few. Just building on what Lance was saying earlier. Deployments and leading practices tends to have a lot of implementation stories, war stories, things that went well, things that were disastrous, and please learn from my horrible example type of stuff. We're seeing quite a breadth of submissions this year. Passkeys and password lists definitely a big thing. And we'll have some sessions that cover some of the adoption challenges people have faced deploying passkeys in their enterprises. Phishing resistance is also really popular. And of course, verifiable credentials is starting to really take off. We talk about mobile driver's licenses, but we've got a session about using verifiable credentials in the agriculture sector, which is just really amazing to me. We're seeing some really interesting applications in places we don't typically expect. And as Andy requested last year during the closing session, we actually did get some authorization submissions this year. So we're going to have some topics that cover authorization, especially in large enterprises, and getting it externalized from applications. So really interesting stuff there. Back to you.
The thing I'm really enjoying is I'm watching people's faces as individuals describe what they saw. So bear in mind that we have a lot of proposals. Everybody on the committee does get the opportunity to kind of look at those, and yet we still have these little expressions of, oh, that sounds interesting, I want to go to that one, right? which gives you some sense of kind of how much is going on, I guess, in the industry. So let me just pick up on a couple of things there, right? So we mentioned passkeys quite a bit. We mentioned some of the federation, the authorization, some of those things. Do you sense, or does anybody sense, that from a technical more than a business perspective, right, are there things that organizations need to be thinking about today to start to adopt some of these things or implement some of these things over the course of the next couple of years? And I'm not necessarily here thinking about fundamental changes like decentralization. I'm thinking more of advances in specific areas that are kind of evolutionary rather than revolutionary. Again, passkeys is the obvious example here, but there are plenty of others. And I just wonder if anyone's got a perspective on if I'm not there yet, what should I be thinking about doing now?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd love to start in on that one. So it's kind of beating the drum again. As a practitioner, the biggest struggle that I see, and again, having been in pharma, been in financial services, they're in a little bit better footing than most, but they also probably have the most money to invest in that space. And then particularly in retail, is there's still almost a poverty line when it comes on the product side. And I don't mean on the identity product side, I mean on the standard side. When technology companies are creating product, identity standards are still an afterthought for so many companies. And I think that's it could almost be a talk topic by itself. But it's I joked recently with my boss. I said, can I go to the National Retail Federation conference next year just so that I can browbeat all of the technology companies that aren't following identity standards? Because it creates a real challenge of experience, both in terms of integration and really just rate of adoption for us. So that's one of the areas that it's kind of, everything is old is new. We're still trying to play catch up in that space.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, Lance. Anyone else have a perspective on this?
Well,
Maybe a couple things. Oh, go ahead, Greg.
All right, I'll go this time. One of the things I see a lot, especially in my current role, is discussions around zero trust. And really, to make zero trust work, you need a lot of good context. And one of the challenges I'm seeing repeatedly is that it's really difficult to get that rich context to make really good enforcement decisions. So that's a technical challenge, but it's also a business challenge in terms of creating the attributes to describe a person's identity, or being able to know the location something's coming from, time of day, has somebody passed all their training, getting that really rich context to see if somebody should be authorized to access what they're trying to access right now in this particular case from this location, like Starbucks, maybe not. So that's something I'm seeing a lot, where people are struggling with their zero trust designs. And the other trend that I've seen recently in the industry is, the evolving workplace. where people need to access stuff from a variety of different places. We had the whole move to work from home. Everybody worked from home during COVID. But I'm seeing a shift back where a lot of companies are asking their employees to be back in the office at least some minimum number of days per week. And they don't necessarily have dedicated office space or know where they're going to be sitting. They need to be able to plop down anywhere with their laptop and get a rich, secure, and effective working experience. And so that's another challenge that I've been seeing recently. Eve, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to sensitize people about, some of the cryptographical resilience that we're going to need. There's going to be some content at the conference about that. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of conversations about quantum resilience, and also about data hygiene and the quality of the data that you have coming in to form all of your signals, which I hope will be layered and multifarious, right? So these are some of the hot topics in a lot of the conversations that I've been having, and knowing that there tend to be some birds of a feather sessions springing up, as well as just amazing hallway conversations. I think that's going to be a lot of the buzz at the conference.
Yeah, you picked up a couple of interesting things, Eve, and full disclosure, I have a close affinity to some of the shared signals work that I was involved in quite early on. But it's very evident to me that we're starting to see some real weight now behind the whole shared signals model, with protocols like, and I always want to pronounce it CAPE. I don't know whether it's officially supposed to be CAPE, but anyway, the Continuous Access Evaluation Protocol, and the risk stuff as well. And I do wonder whether there's a longer term trend there in terms of, more continuous real time evaluation, decision making, around access that I'm not sure we're architecturally kind of equipped to do today, but I sense that we may be moving in that direction, which I think is probably a good thing, but it's going to have some interesting implications for how stuff's deployed. The other thing you brought up, Eve, is the kind of quantum resilience. And we actually had a really, really interesting presentation from somebody. We did a couple of regional events for Identiverse at the back end of last year, one in New York, one in Chicago. And a lady called Teresa Wu gave a really interesting presentation about not just what post-quantum is and why it's relevant, which, I think a lot of people are familiar with, but there are folks certainly in the identity side of the house that perhaps haven't explored that. But more importantly, what implications does that have specifically for identity and IAM deployments? That was really, really interesting. I think we've got it video archived somewhere, at least a recording of it someplace. So worth having a look at if anyone's particularly interested in that. I'd like, if I may, to move on to a little bit away from some of the technical conversation, and into more of the business conversation. So one of the things I think that we within the industry have struggled perhaps with over the last decade or so is we all know that the work that we do in identity has an awful lot to do with the user experience, and whether that user is a customer, a consumer, a business customer, part of the supply chain, or an internal customer of some kind, that the experience that they have in doing their work in the digital sphere is fundamentally impacted by the stuff that we all deploy every day. And so one of the things that we're trying to do at Identiverse this year is to open up a little bit more of that business conversation, in part to get some of those, sort of business owners in the room and understanding what we do, but also to help equip practitioners and professionals with the right data, the right arguments, the right information, the right examples to be able to go back into the business and say, hey, I want to deploy passkey, and it's not just about security, right? I want to deploy continuous access evaluation, but it's not just about security. It's about making the user experience better. It's about reducing churn. It's about improving the customer experience. It's about getting our net promoter score to be higher. It's about attracting more customers more rapidly than we can do elsewhere. It's about optimizing, the way that our supply chain operates. So are you all seeing early examples of those sorts of things starting to arise, either through some of what we're seeing, through the CFP, or in some of the other experience, the other work that you all have? Or am I just making this up and hoping?
I don't think you're making it up. Sorry, did you want to go?
You go ahead, and then I have something to add.
Okay, good. No, I definitely don't think you're making it up, Andy. Certainly in my pharmaceutical career as a practitioner, I couldn't get my projects approved. I couldn't get funding and budget approval if I didn't have business outcomes defined. So it's not super new, but as practitioners, if we're suffering doing something day after day, and it would cost more to bring in a technology to replace that and implement it. Our business leaders have other places to spend their money, and they're happy for us to keep slaving away. So my projects that were successful always had business outcomes in terms of better user experience, in terms of money saved or costs avoided. And they're the people who approve the budget. So we need to talk to them in business terms. And I'm glad that we're starting to see more of that conversation at this conference, because it has always been about technology, and that's one of the hardest things to sell up in an organization. So definitely something that I'm seeing a lot. And now, as on the sales side of things, of course, if I'm talking to the practitioners, they can't get budget, they can't get approval, I'm not going to get a sale. But if I'm talking to those business leaders, they only want to hear about the business outcomes, whether it's improved user experience, improved security, still important at the board level. So if we can deploy something that improves user experience and provides better security and reduces that reputational risk of breach, it's a powerful message to take to business leaders. So definitely not making it up.
I agree with Greg. You're making it up. And I would add too, like on the UX side, I know that the FIDO Alliance has spent a lot of time and resources on developing UX guidelines, for example, because people are starting to recognize how essential it is that security services are also usable. Otherwise, they just won't be adopted. But the other thing that I saw in the security track, tagging a little bit maybe to what Greg was saying about, justifying and kind of business value, I feel like we're starting to see a lot more candid research being published from various vendors about the types of attacks that we're seeing online, as well as more discrete user behaviors, like what types of MFA devices are people selecting and things of that nature. I think that's really valuable, not just so that the general public and consumers of the technology can become a little bit more aware of what's going on and, that they themselves have a risk posture, but also so that people can take it to their business leaders and say like, hey, it is really difficult sometimes to justify like what we need to invest in security services because we don't have the data until the thing we're trying to prevent happens. But these other companies have gone ahead and given us a model that we can use as a proxy. So I'm really excited to see that content this year.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another thread I kind of want to pull on here, and there's, I think, going to be a great talk around some of these issues having to do with the way identity has to fight with, I want to be careful how I say this, and it's almost like sort of the evil Spock, in the Mirror Mirror Star Trek universe. Data monetization as a topic is the business model topic that we have to sort of almost pit identity, or at least identity with privacy, against. And there's going to be some of that at Identiverse, and I think it's really timely because it sort of raises the stakes about the entire view of the organization and how collectively the different stakeholders are not just talking about, but acting on the use of personal data. And I think this comes not a moment too soon.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd actually made a note here in the background earlier that there's a whole privacy conversation here. And again, privacy and ethics is something that we've had material at Identiverse, for years actually in that area. And again, from year to year, it goes up, it goes down a little bit depending on what's happening. And it's always fascinating to me that conversation tends to be driven by a reaction to regulation mostly, with a few exceptional circumstances where it's a proactive choice by a business to say, I want to do this a better way, right? I want to engage my customers in a less intrusive way, and I'm choosing to do that rather than being forced to go there because I think there is a commercial benefit, and or because I recognize that the risk of me handling this data is frankly too large.
Well, and this is where, the data that Arynn's talking about, there's starting to be more and more data about the impacts of consumer trust and customer trust, as well as the liability aspects. So all that data is to the good because it helps people make better decisions. And by the way, thank you for saying privacy. I think we've turned you from the privacy world.
So this reminds me very much of we had a lengthy debate actually during a main stage panel last year about how we should pronounce the job title, which is abbreviated to the letters CISO, and I'm not even going to go there because I thought there were only two ways of pronouncing it, and it turns out there were four, and we lost complete control of 2,500, 3,000 people in a room at that point. It was kind of entertaining. But
if I could, Andy, I did want to tug a little bit on something that Eve talked about, because I think we have a challenge, particularly in the vendor space. What I saw last year was a huge shift by many of the main companies in this space, calling themselves the identity security company, and I think part of it was to try and forge a little bit more of a closer bond to tie identities to security so that we could tap into some of those security budgets. And it's a completely understandable thing. But I think Greg touched on a critical component that once we get beyond the RFP and we start getting into the discussions and evaluations of where is the real opportunity here, we can't just view it in security terms. As Eve just touched on, the privacy component is going to become even more critical as we move forward, and the UX. And that's where the marketing of identity within the organization has to become almost an engine unto itself, because you have to balance that. So for the companies, especially our wonderful sponsors at Identiverse, I would encourage them, by all means, embrace the identity security construct, but make sure that you've got people like a Greg in your organization that can talk to what the actual business outcomes beyond the security benefit of implementing identity can do for you, because it's all three. It's security, it's identity, and it's privacy.
Yeah, those are great thoughts, Lance. Thank you. And it reminds me that I think, in this business conversation, at least up until now, we've been really thinking about how can I optimize my existing business, right? As we start to look at some of the newer technologies that are coming along, some of the newer approaches that are coming along from an identity standpoint specifically, I do wonder whether there's an opportunity for us to look at some of those business models and do things not just better, but fundamentally differently. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on this, but I wonder if anyone's got thoughts around, hey, look, travel could be so much better if we only took advantage of XYZ thing. And I said Z. I just want everyone to recognize that Z is just wrong. XYZ. Thank you. No one has any thoughts about novel business models that some of this new identity architecture might introduce. I know Eve has thoughts about this.
I do. I feel like I've been on a soapbox for so long. I mean, I think we need to look through the lens of almost each piece of information as a product. And I gave a talk at EIC last year, verifiable credentials in this light. And if you go credential by credential, you'll find that the ecosystem that would need to support it to make the flywheel go, each one would really be quite different as to, is everybody incentivized enough to change their behavior? And I think that we'd be wise to treat each piece of information about a person as something that has value, which means we have to articulate to whom and for what exactly. And it has risk, same. And I've been thinking of this as like a sort of a data value chain. And, there's starting to be some technologies that we could apply to this analysis. And the IAM stuff that we know and love could support it, I think, very readily. I think there's some missing pieces to supporting it. But if we have that view, we will no longer, have incorrect notions of, hanging on to this data and asking people for this data, even if we didn't use it yet. Maybe it nets out to, we're losing money on every deal, but we're going to make volume. We don't want to do that. We want to get that.
Yeah. No, I go ahead.
I was just going to emphasize, I think when we talk about the future business models for identity, the future is kind of here now, right? Like we're going through this massive revolution where post-COVID, everything went digital so quickly. Like you can do anything online now. Banking has become increasingly digitized, like talking with our friends, work, etc. To Eve's point, though, I think the missing ingredient is that the reliability that we have in remote proofing, for example, which is going to be a big part of that story, and many businesses are now popping up around. The primitives that are underneath them were not yet aligned, I think, on a standardized mechanism that is privacy respecting as well as secure and usable and easy for users, not just in the US with our conventional proofs, but also across the globe where access to and identity documents vary so much. I think it's not that there's a new business model, it's that it's here maybe, and we need to figure out how do we finish responding to it and support it better.
That's a really interesting perspective, Arynn. Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think you touch on a couple of things. I'm going to be utterly shameless at this point. I am I think the first time ever actually doing a presentation in the main agenda at Identiverse. And I'm going to talk with Steve Wilson about proofing creep, right? So I think that there's some interesting risk around, yeah, there's absolutely cases where we need and should be doing proper, high strength, well assured, privacy respecting identity proofing. But there's also a lot of places where we shouldn't be doing it. And I think there's a real risk that we end up getting dragged there. And that's relevant to the identity practitioner today, because I think a lot of folks in this industry aren't equipped yet to ask those questions, or aren't empowered to ask those questions in the kind of design planning meetings that we get into, right? Wait, why are we doing proofing? Are we sure we should be doing proofing here? Is that the right thing for us to be doing? Like, that's an important question to ask. And your point about inclusion and designing solutions that work for all the use cases, including the edge cases, because one man's edge case is somebody else's every day, right? And we do have to remember that, I think. We're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about security, cybersecurity in particular. So I know we brought up a couple of things earlier on around zero trust, around things like privileged access and those sorts of things, right? And it's true that for most identity practitioners today, mostly people roll up to a security function, right? And we can have a lengthy conversation. In fact, we have had a lengthy conversation. We'll probably have it again about, is that the right thing? Should we start to see identity more under a business lead of some kind, digital transformation leader potentially, or even a chief identity officer? And we had a panel around that at Identiverse last year. I know a blog post just came out from Martin Kuppinger at EIC, just posted something a little while ago about this very topic. The reality is, though, that most practitioners today report up to security functions. So by necessity, security is a large part of what they do. Are we getting a sense that there are novel, specifically identity-related security issues that are arising? And or are there novel approaches to dealing with security issues that identity uniquely enables? And whilst you think about the answer to that, you can also ponder whether it's securing the identity or using identity as part of our security mechanisms, or both.
Oh yeah, the prepositions are always a good question. Which direction? I'm just going to name the elephant in the room, which is the short-lived server-side biometrics spring that we were in for maybe a year and a half or so before an AI got really popular. This is messing with a lot of proofing plan and authentication plans, and really means people have to have really good hygiene about how they even think about biometric.
Yeah, I
there's
was
no.
literally just mentioning this
Go ahead.
yesterday in my class, because I had the joy of doing the identity module in my introduction to cybersecurity class, and we had a long discussion about biometrics and the fact that we have the ability to impersonate people depending upon which modalities are being used. I did discover, however, somebody came up with, have they figured out how to do deep fakes with Venn biometrics? And I did not have an answer to that.
The arms race is really kind of impressive, right? So iProve has a new threat report out, and Yoti just came out with a report, and FaceTech has a really interesting site called liveness.com that I think is really worth looking at for the research. I did a talk last week about the race against time that we're in right now, because of, like Arynn pointing out, that AI scales, so it scales, automates, and that's exactly what we want to guard against. And so we partly have to go back to basics, and we partly have to kind of really up our liveness detection game. And these are things that are essential. They're essential to security because security depends on authentication. Maybe less so on proofing, as you just pointed out, Andi, but these things will be heavy topics of conversation, and every month that passes, there's an increasing recognition of the magnitude of this threat.
I think authentication time and biometrics are obviously incredibly relevant to identity, but there's other parts in the security flow too that I think are going to become even more reliant on identity. When we talk about it at AWS, we often break this down by, like, what are we talking about at account creation time versus sign-in time, and then there are other stages in the funnel. We have proofs, different authentication mechanisms that we can use to try to deter people that are coming at the front gate at sign-in time. But especially if we're looking at, like, fraudulent account creation, like people creating accounts to abuse promos, to drive up traffic, all kinds of different motivations, you can only rely on network and client-based signals or so much, because they can be spoofed and because they can only be so unique. So I think in that case, what I'm seeing is I'm looking across different vendors, I'm looking across some of the talks that we've seen not only at Identiverse, but RSA and other places, that we're talking a lot more about clustering based on attributes that are either collected through identity services or maintained by identity services, because they are becoming a more unique and reliable way to identify actors when you don't have the luxury of obtaining additional proofs at sign-in time, for example.
I'm going to loop back to Andy's question. Sorry, Andy. I'm going to loop back to your original question, because we digressed very valuably. But getting back to security and identity and where things sit organizationally, I typically see customer-facing identity being more business aligned and not part of security. But when I'm looking at workforce, identity seems best served being part of a security organization if you don't have a chief identity officer available in your company. What I found in my experience was it was tough to get funding for identity projects when I was part of technology, and moving into the security organization where our CISO, and we were just having a debate about CISO versus CISO, and I often use both interchangeably, but now I'm deliberately using CISO. She understood identity, and so she funded stuff, and she could communicate to the board. But what I really think is important for businesses, especially when they have consumer-facing functions, is that all of these practices are intertwined and talking to each other and aligning on the right actions to take for the good of the business. So that's customer identity, workforce identity, security, and privacy. And I think that they can't be independent of each other. And I think that happens too often in businesses.
I think to seize on that a little bit, Greg, and I'll admit this is a bit of a shameless plug for the higher ed component. Part of the value proposition of getting identity into higher ed wasn't just so that we create new identity professionals. The extension of it actually was, how do we get identity concepts beyond the bubble of computer science and cybersecurity and move it into things like you just mentioned, get it into the business school so that they're thinking about those concepts as they graduate. And that identity winds up, while it can roll up to the security function, you may have analysts in your organization that are already steeped in those concepts that can represent those use cases at the business line. And that's going to ultimately create value throughout the enterprise, not just at the security layer.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, Lance. And I think, one of the things that we saw in the, I'm going to say it the right way now, privacy space, is that when GDPR came in Europe, and obviously that had an impact globally as well, but there was a requirement on large organizations to implement a senior level privacy role, right? The DPO. And suddenly boards became aware that this was something they had to care about. Yes, they knew that the regulation was coming. Yes, they knew it was going to have an impact. But suddenly it was like, no, this has to be on the agenda at every board meeting. And if it's on the agenda at a board meeting, then by definition, it's on an executive's radar, right? And I think, we're not quite there with identity yet, but I think what you're pointing at, Lance, is there's a case for that. And the more that we make that case, I think, the stronger we're going to get in the end in terms of the outcome that we want to see. And that also provides a very helpful segue for us. Thank you, Lance. Because I'd love to talk a little bit about, there's lots of change coming, right? Lots of change that's already happened, and we're looking forward to see what else is on the horizon. And my sense is that perhaps more than many years previously, some of this change is going to have a real impact on the way that practitioners in this space think about the skills that they're acquiring, think about the way that they train, the way that they recruit, the way that they develop their own careers. Now, I know that Lance is going to have a particular perspective on this, but I suspect everybody is going to have some things that they want to say about how do professionals in the space think about, okay, what do I learn next? Where do I invest? How do I develop my skills?
So I think Andy teed me up. So I'll go ahead and bite on that. It's an interesting space, and I think one of the things that is such a great value for us, if you go back to Andy, I know this is near and dear to your heart, the ID Pro Skills Survey. One of the things that we discovered was identity professionals come from such a broad and diverse background. So the answer is going to actually vary a little bit by professional. If you have come from the dyed-in-the-wool comp sci program, nothing wrong with that, but you are going to be looking at some of the more human elements of your journey, which is totally fine. I know Arynn and I had the pleasure of doing a podcast with Mike Kaiser where we were kind of celebrating that of, coming from these diverse experiences. So I do think, it is going to depend on the professional, but I'll pick on it from a classic computer science, IT oriented professional. You are going to be looking at a lot more of the human elements behind this, and also even looking at data. As Eve was touching on earlier, I think the way we think about data just in the past decade has changed like exponentially. And I think focusing on that, even maybe taking some things in data science to understand some of those elements as well, might be an interesting avenue to explore.
I think you really nailed it there, Lance. I want to build on that a little bit. People learn different ways. So taking the perspective of the person who's trying to learn this stuff. Some people do really well in a classroom setting. Some people go off and research on their own. Others, work through a lab and then experiment and play with stuff. But what people have to do to be successful in this space is to constantly be learning whichever way works best for them. If you don't keep learning, you're going to get left behind really fast. And I've had almost 40 years in the industry, 35 of which has been in identity. I started in higher ed. I moved to pharmaceuticals. Now I'm in software. The thing that served me well is constantly learning new stuff. This space has evolved so much over the decades, and it's just getting faster.
Yeah, I might build on this by maybe doubling down on the notion of having to really get cross-functional. So yes, talk to the business, but like thinking about that sort of data hygiene question, you're probably going to have to cozy up to data scientists and enterprise architects. And one of the toughest nuts to crack in the identity world has been externalizing authorization, because the stakeholders there, I think, are largely the ones that are impacting the ability to do that, negatively impacting it, they're sort of largely invisible to us. I don't know why that is, and that's something that the AuthZen group is sort of trying to pick apart, and the Authorize conference folks who are, I know, working with Andi et al. So really being empathetic and putting yourself in the shoes of other folks is a great way to grow your career and grow your influence. Like, I've been asked from time to time, do you want to be right or do you want to be heard? Well, the best way to be heard is to actually do some active listening.
Yeah.
Spot on.
I agree with everything that my peers here have said. And I would also add, like, as somebody who, to Lance's point, came in from a different background, I actually started at Amazon in our operations center. I was taking customer service calls. I studied political science. I have no formal computer science background whatsoever. So I've been learning a lot of this on the fly, and I agree, like, you have to be curious. I think that having exposure across many different disciplines is super useful as practitioners. But I also think you really have to make use of all the resources that we have in our community. I tell new people that we bring into our team all the time that are new to identity, that identity is a very community-oriented discipline. We have resources like ID Pro. We have a lot of people that are very excited and eager to mentor. And I think that it's hard to undersell how valuable it is when there is so much information about identity out there. There is more and more content every day. But if you don't know yet what you don't know, it's hard to kind of separate out, like, what is really, like, genuinely valuable for me to learn next versus what will overwhelm me. So having people around you that can help you make that kind of mind map, help you through that process, I think makes it feel a lot more fun and a lot more successful too.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I'll pick up on a couple of things that are actually specific to the Identiverse conference. So a couple of you mentioned ID Pro. ID Pro is the Association for Digital Identity Professionals. Again, full disclosure, I'm one of the founding members. I was on the board for a number of years. I've stepped back from that now. The organization is quite happy moving along without that input. But ID Pro will be obviously at the event in strength. And one of the things that they help us with is they put together a first time at Identiverse session on the Tuesday afternoon. It'll be this year, right before the sort of main agenda starts. We did it for the first time last year. We honestly didn't know, what to expect. We thought, wow, if we get 50 people along, that'd be great. It was like 200 people just spilling out of the room. We got really good feedback. So ID Pro is going to run that again this year. And for anyone that's listening to this and it's their first time at Identiverse and they're like, don't quite know how to get started and how to navigate this and who to talk to and how to get engaged, highly recommend going along to that session because it's a really good way to sort of kickstart things. I also wanted to pick up on your point, Arynn, about diverse backgrounds. This is entirely anecdotal, but the number of people in this industry that I've spoken to that do not have a formal kind of computer science background is huge. And, if that happens to be you, again, as you're listening to this, I do not feel afraid about this. It's a very welcoming industry and a very welcoming conference as a result. And it does make it, a good way to start to explore and absorb some of these new skills that, we're all starting to talk about. I'll mention one other, and then we're going to wrap things up fairly quickly here. But we talked about AI briefly, and then we've avoided it very carefully for pretty much everything else. I do think that there are some implications about how we do our jobs that AI is going to bring. Not so much from a technical perspective, although clearly, that's true. But I think, skills around evaluating content, evaluating writing, rather than just creating it, editing rather than writing, is not something that a lot of us necessarily trained to do as we were, coming through school or university or whatever it might be. It's a different set of skills. And I think that professionals are going to be well advised to start to explore how they can learn to do that sort of monitoring, I guess, a little bit better. So we're going to wrap up. We've got about 3 minutes to do this next little bit. And what I'd like to do is to go around each of our fabulous panelists. And again, thank you for their time today. And just give me a couple of briefish sentences. What's the one thing that you are either particularly looking forward to at Identiverse this year, or particularly looking forward to in the industry this year, or both? And we'll just run around. And whilst that's happening, if anyone that's listening does have any questions, feel free to drop those in the Q&A, and I'll take a quick look as we run around. And I am going to nominate people this time. I'm going to start with Eve.
Okay, I'm excited about, both for Identiverse reasons and for industry reasons, all of the authorization work going on. I mentioned it briefly before. We've got just a number of really good sessions, an authorization conversation. We're going to have graph information, architectural patterns, and also kind of other than technology problems with the challenges we face with authorization, from our friends Sarah Cicchetti and Peter Castleman. And I just think it's going to be amazing. And I think authorati is a word that maybe got coined last year at Identiverse. And okay, these are sort of supposed to be pejoratives that we just lean into. So I think we need to lean into it now.
Excellent. Thank you. So we're going to move along to Greg.
Well, for deployments and leading practices, we have 20 sessions, 2 master classes, and a panel. And they're all fantastic and really shaping up. And I can't wait to see the content that they're starting to put together. But 2 in particular that come to mind, Dean Sachs from AWS will be doing a talk on debugging FIDO at scale that is going to be incredibly informative for folks. And Matt Topper from Uber Ether has a really fascinating topic, and I can't share the title without giving too much away, but make sure you come to that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Greg. We're going to nip along to Arynn.
2 quick things. I'm excited to see in the industry broadly the evolution of passkeys this year. I think it'd be remiss to not call attention to that with so much content that we have, both as Greg mentioned on the debugging side, as well as seeing from folks like Shane Whedon at IBM, actual deployment stories. I think that although this technology is in the early days and there's still some maturity to go through, there's so much promise for consumers and enterprises alike. And then on the actual Identiverse side, I'm really excited to see some of the new folks that will be in the sessions that Andi mentioned, welcoming newcomers. Identiverse was really the catalyst for me forming my identity community, and I'm excited to get to meet every year folks that are having that moment themselves.
Wonderful. Thanks, Arynn. Lance, you've got 40 seconds. Go.
Oh, my. So 2 notes. One, I do want to tie in on what Arynn just said. I started speaking at Identiverse. Basically, I don't want to quite call it as a dare from Andre Durand at Ping Identity, but it kind of was, because I thanked him, because the only way I got to go to this show ages ago was by winning the t-shirt contest. And I thanked him for it because it was such an amazing experience. And he looked at me and he said, "You can thank me by speaking at this conference next year and share what you know." And to tie into what Arynn said, one of the things that has me the most excited is the number of new speakers that we have, that it's not just some of the same old topics and some of the same old people. And I point at myself in that category as well. I'm just excited to see all of the fresh voices that are coming in. I think it's going to be an amazing show.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lance. Thank you, everyone, to our panelists, obviously, for sharing their wisdom and expertise and insights with us today. Thanks to everyone for attending and joining us. And my thing is, I'm just looking forward to seeing everyone at Identiverse in May. Go to the Identiverse website, register there. And thanks very much indeed for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thanks.